Hello, everyone. I'll start this session. As I can see, people are still joining, but let me still start this session. So that those that are on time don't have to wait. My name is Markus Löning, and I'm very happy that you're all joining this Ask the Experts webinar. I'm the founder of Löning, Human Rights and Responsible Business, and we're a management consultancy helping companies understand their exposure to human rights risk and what their business has, what kind of impact their business has potentially on human rights. So how to identify these risks, how to manage these risks, and everything around that. So we're specializing in business and human rights. Let me introduce you briefly to my colleagues, Raquel Althoff, who's with me today. She's going to talk about her experience. Raquel is the lead of our consultancy team. She's been in business and human rights for many, many years, and she's a very experienced consultant working with clients from all different sectors, from different sizes. So she's seen a lot, and she's going to share some of that experience with us today. And there's also Stephanie Borowiec with us, who's a senior consultant at Löning and who's also working with major clients from our portfolio. And one of the projects she's actually heading at the moment is, for example, developing a standard for responding to business and human rights due diligence needs for the chemical and pharmaceutical industry in Germany. So very happy that all of you joined and that so many of you joined today. So what we see, or why we are doing this expert session today, is that reporting and transparency are important elements of any human rights due diligence system, as it is set out by the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, and also by the different OECD guidances that are out there. So transparency and reporting are key to meeting human rights due diligence expectations. Obviously, these expectations of the UN Guiding Principles now materialize in different laws and regulations at the national level, at the transnational level, at the EU, for example. And all of these laws are implementing at the core the UN Guiding Principles. Now, with the German Supply Chain Act entering into force in a little more than 3 months, so there's not so much more time to go, a lot of companies have approached us lately and saying, you know, we're preparing for the reporting requirements under Lieferketten-Gesetz, so how should we do that? And we receive more and more requests, so that we thought it would be a good idea to create this short webinar, which will give some insights into how to set it up and how to actually also use the reporting for the good of your company. So beyond answering your questions today, which will be in the second part of the webinar, we're also very interested in hearing from you what your views and your thoughts and also your concerns or your challenges are regarding reporting. And next to existing legal requirements, those that are in place already, but also those that are looming from Brussels, different EU regulations on the financial side, but also on the corporate side that are in the making, increasing demand by actually investors is something that we hear a lot. So we have different requirements from companies that said, actually, yes, we know we need to commit to comply with the law, but also we have private equity investors or other institutional investors demanding more human rights due diligence and more reporting to make things more transparent for them. So it's quite interesting that this has become an important driver for companies to improve their human rights performance and to work more seriously on that than even legal provisions have been. So reporting and reliable data is something that's key for financial institutions. And that's another reason why we believe that reporting will also change and will undergo change in the coming years. We will see an increase in requirement there, but also we will see an increase of more qualitative data being delivered there by companies. So one thing we believe, and I think that's maybe the core message of what we want to bring across today, is that reporting should be more than just a compliance exercise. It can and it should be used to improve a company's internal and external processes to respect human rights. And it should also serve as a tool to review and enhance business models and corporate strategies. So you have to do it. If you have to do it, use it to the very best of your company. That's basically what we're saying, and that we're going to briefly touch upon today. We're going to touch on 4 topics. First of all, doing the homework, explaining what is the German Supply Chain Act actually requiring from companies. Then we're going to touch upon how the German reporting requirements are actually linked with other upcoming and existing reporting standards. Then we will touch upon the question how reporting is related to and how it can be used to improve management systems implementation. And finally, we're going to have a short bit also on how to use the content that's created by the reporting exercises for other communication purposes, like generally a better engagement of important stakeholders. So the format today is going to be that we will introduce you to the topic, share some of our knowledge, which will take around 25 or so minutes maybe, and then we will open the floor to your questions for the last 15 minutes. So please feel free to use the Q&A box which Zoom is providing, and just type them in, and then you can also upvote questions that you like or that you want us to answer. And also, if you want to ask questions live, please raise your hand, and our colleague Sarah is going to give you the floor if that's possible. And if we cannot answer all the questions, just in case there's too many questions or they're too difficult, we're of course going to come back to you with an email after the end of this webinar. So let me start by asking Steffi if she could give us an overview of what the German Supply Chain Act, the Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichten-Gesetz, to say it once at least in the correct way. So what does this law actually require from companies regarding reporting?
Yeah, thank you, Markus. Also from my side, welcome to everyone. So basically, the reporting requirements of the LkSG can be separated into 2 groups. Process-related requirements and then content-related ones. So if we maybe first touch a little bit upon the process-related requirements. So what we know is that companies who fall under the law must report annually on the fulfillment of their due diligence obligations in the previous financial year. And the report must be publicly available. It must be free of charge on the company's website. And it must be submitted to the BAFA no later than 4 months after the end of the financial year. So that means, for example, for a company which has a financial year ending on the 31st of December 2023, will need to submit and publish their first report no later than on the 30th of April 2024. We also know that the report needs to be available for 7 years on the company's website. Important to mention here is that the BAFA has released some additional information about the format of the report. So we know now that the BAFA is preparing a questionnaire. It will entail open questions, closed questions, and multiple choice questions that companies need to answer. And then there will be a report generated automatically out of those answers and then submitted to the BAFA. And then this report can also be published or needs to be published by the company on their website. So that means that a company who completes this questionnaire truthfully and comprehensively and then submits it to the BAFA and reports and publishes on the website will fulfill the reporting requirements according to Section 10, paragraph 2 of the Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichten-Gesetz. So that's briefly on the process-related requirements. If we now look more into the content-related ones, what do companies actually need to report on? Well, the actual questions are not released yet, but what do we know so far and what do we maybe expect? What we know so far is that companies that are subject to the law must at least provide information about the following. First of all, they need to say if they have identified any human rights and environment-related risks and violations, and if so, which ones. So they really need to have a deep understanding of the risks and possibly also the violations that the company is connected to. Then the second point is, and that's the more comprehensive part, what has the enterprise actually done to fulfill its due diligence obligations? So basically describing the due diligence processes that a company set up. And that entails a variety of things, right? The risk management system as a whole, which also includes the risk analysis as a core element, then the measures that are derived out on basis of the risk analysis, the grievance mechanism, which is very important for rights holders to raise any complaints and grievances, and also how the company has fulfilled the due diligence obligation in the deeper supply chain with indirect suppliers. And then the third point is that companies also need to explain how they have assessed the effectiveness of the measure. So that's another criteria. And finally, what conclusions the company has drawn from this assessment for future measures. So we expect the BAFA questionnaire to follow a similar structure with the questionnaire, basically asking companies to report, for example, which risks they have identified, and also on the processes that are in place. So we expect questions such as more on a governance and high level, who is responsible for the risk management in your company? Do you have a human rights policy? If there are any risks have been identified, is there a policy in place? What does the policy actually say? How does your risk analysis process look like? What scope does it have? How have you prioritized your risk? What measures have you put in place to reduce the risks? So these are all questions that we expect the BAFA to ask companies, and that companies need to be prepared to answer. And that is why it is so important to really document in a meaningful and comprehensive structured way when you set up and also further develop your due diligence processes in the company, to then be able to really answer all these questions without an additional effort of collecting the information together afterwards. Also important to emphasize maybe is that these processes that companies need to set up to then in the second step be able also to report on, they are time intensive, yes, and also resource intensive to set up. But once they are set up, they can fulfill a variety of purposes. So for example, addressing rising stakeholder expectations, like Markus mentioned, with financial institutions or also business clients. And of course, also to fulfill future legal requirements, such as the CSRD. So that's why we always recommend our clients to really look into what requirements they have to fulfill, also beyond the LkSG, and to, from the beginning, set up robust and holistic human rights due diligence processes that they are able to cover both the existing legal and other requirements that they may have, and also upcoming ones. So that to not do this exercise, to fulfill a variety of requirements. Recently is that how the LkSG relates to, for example, the EU reporting directive, and also well-established standards such as the GRI. And that's something we discuss actually quite a lot in our team. And yeah, maybe Raquel, you can elaborate a little bit on that question.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steffi. And thanks for introducing the requirements regarding reporting of the German Supply Chain Act. So indeed, our clients, they are already reporting under other frameworks, reporting frameworks. They're also monitoring the new legal developments on the topic. And of course, we are also monitoring these developments. So here we just bring a list just to give you some examples on this kind of overlap and the need to address them in a structured manner. So here, just to give an example, mention the CSRD, which is going to replace the non-financial reporting directive. Also, we have the EU taxonomy. So these are legal requirements, but we also have voluntary frameworks that many companies have been using, such as the GRI mostly, and also the UNGP reporting framework. So just to address the overlap of these standards, I'd like to bring an example here. So as Steffi just mentioned, for the Lieferketten-Gesetz, we're expecting to have more details on the reporting requirements by the BAFA soon with the questionnaire. However, if you think of the CSRD, we already have a public draft on the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which will be the basis for this legislation, right? So in the example I bring here, I'd like to highlight 2 points. One is there are similarities, right? Looking to the Lieferketten-Gesetz and the CSRD. So both require companies to explain the risk assessment and the results of the risk assessment. But I also would like to highlight the difference of them, right? So the Lieferketten-Gesetz is focusing on operations and supply chain, while the CSRD is focusing on the whole value chain, right? So in this example here of the ESRS, we see that the way they're looking into the rights holders, the group of rights holders, considering the whole value chain, so looking to own workforce, workers in the value chain, affected communities, but also end users and consumers. So the reason I'd like to highlight this example here is to show that, of course, it's very important to have a combined solution when preparing to report, when defining a reporting strategy. You need to look into all the frameworks you're going to use and put them together to really make sure that you address them in a meaningful way. But also it's important to take into consideration the highest level of requirements. And this is something we've been telling our clients since the beginning when implementing the Lieferketten-Gesetz, it's very important to really take a risk-based approach, look into your whole value chain, consider downstream as well, really go deeper in their upstream supply chain so that you really align with all the standards that are upcoming, as we can see here in this example of the CSRD.
You're on mute still, Markus. Sorry.
Yeah, better without mute. Well, once again, thanks a lot to both of you for this quick introduction. Obviously, in 25 minutes, we cannot go super deep into the topic, but we want to provide an overview. And obviously, I mean, you're free to ask questions also to come back at us anytime you feel there's more questions that may arise in the coming days. So now we have heard about the different reporting requirements, the ones that are in place already and the ones that are upcoming. Now, I'd like to spend a few minutes on the question, how does that actually, what does that mean in practice? How does that relate to existing management system or to management systems that have to be established while setting up a human rights due diligence processes? So maybe, Raquel, you could also give us a short idea of, you know, how that is going to work out in practice and how that is going to implement the human rights risk management system as a whole.
Yeah, sure, Markus. Maybe we can get to then, we have a slide, I think, going to the management system that we could share. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so actually, it's very important to understand this reporting exercise as an opportunity, right, to engage the diverse teams inside the company to make sure the implementation works well. And what I'd like to highlight here is that the fact that you need to report every year should trigger actually a willingness inside the teams to constantly improve their performance, right? So reporting should be really used as an output of this management system as a way to really have this annual moment where you really look into your targets and KPIs and so that you really have this engagement, right? So it's very important to understand that we always start in the risk management system with the risk assessment. And this is actually what is requested under the Lieferketten-Gesetz as the first thing you need to report on. And as you understand your risk, you also need to understand your management capacity. So what do you have in place to comply with the law and to manage these risks, right? And this is also something you need to report on. So under the reporting requirements, you also need to understand your effectiveness so that you can explain how much are you doing and how much you're committing to do in the next year. So as you can see, everything is really connected to the risk management system. And it's very important to use then the reporting, as I said, as a way to having this annual moment where you really review your KPIs, set your targets, and engage internally the teams so that everyone can commit to these targets, right? And I'm sure that Steffi has a lot of experience in that she can share also some ideas with you.
Yes, that's good. Just going to ask her to do.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, it was really good to see, yeah, how the reporting needs to really be deeply connected to the management system, and also how the risk assessment is kind of the core part of it as well. What I maybe would like to add more on a let's say high level or like soft factors is that it already has been sort of mentioned briefly that the reporting exercise should really go beyond a pure compliance exercise, but used to really engage the important internal stakeholders inside your company. So to really build ownership as well in these functions, to sit together and take stock, re-strategize, reflect on the performance of the companies, and also set future goals, and to really build a strong collaboration with these relevant internal functions. And that will also improve the governance structures around in your company around human rights issues, and thus also make the reporting exercise a bit easier and more effective. And I guess the second point would be to also engage the top management in this exercise, or on the topic. And here the reporting requirements that get tighter and also more detailed. And as Markus has explained, we also expect like raising qualitative expectations here to engage with the top management, to also get the necessary resources that you need to, first of all, also set up those human rights due diligence processes in a respective way. And the third point, I guess, would be to really use the reporting as a tool for continuous improvement. And Raquel mentioned that already, that it's an ongoing process. So it's a great opportunity to further develop the human rights strategy, and also to really drive internal implementation of the goals that you are setting yourself. Yeah, I guess that's kind of what I wanted to add. Raquel, is there anything else you want to add on a more practical level?
No, I think that's it. I think in summary, I think that's exactly that. Thanks, Steffi.
Yeah. No problem. Then maybe Markus, would also interesting to hear, like you, before you founded Löning, and before even you have been in politics and acted as a human rights commissioner, you were also busy with in a communications agency. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit more how the reporting can be used, beyond the pure compliance bit of needing to do it.
Sure. I mean, it's good. Communication has been my job before I went into politics, and then obviously, once you're a politician, communication is really key to what you're doing, and it still is. And I believe that sustainability in general, but also respect for human rights, is something that companies should be using a lot more in different ways. And let me just briefly touch on a few, just to give a few ideas of how content of a report can be used. And it might also make, let's say, it might make it easier to engage with colleagues if they understand this is not just a pure legal compliance exercise with a couple of boxes that need to be ticked or so, but that there is a real use, there's an extra benefit for the company if you do that well. As Steffi and Raquel were pointing out, for driving management systems and their implementation, but also for communicating. To give you just a few examples, so the most obvious one is obviously to talk to your own employees about the results of the human rights report, because what we see and what we know from surveys is that the identification of employees with their own company, with their brand, is a lot higher if they feel their company is on the right side and is really respecting the environment, but also respecting those people in the value chains that create the value for the company. So an internal communication is very important, and that should definitely go beyond what's just in a legal report. It's also a demonstration of a commitment to transparency. And as I was saying at the beginning, this is something that we all need to get used to. Transparency is a new thing that companies need to be a lot more transparent to create trust. There is a lot of mistrust out there in the public domain about companies, about corporations, and the way they work. And one of the things and one of the key factors to create trust again is being more transparent. The reporting is also a tool that you can use to measure impact, and measuring impacts of what you've been doing, which is a requirement under the UN Guiding Principles, is something which is actually really hard at the moment, because there's not so much methodology out there. There's not so much data out there. And some of the topics we're talking about are very hard to measure. So it is important to create something and say, okay, this is where we were last year, this is where we are this year, and this is our strategy for the next upcoming 2-3 years. So really looking at impact as far as you can and working on doing that in a better way is, I think, a really important use of reporting in general. That will certainly, enhancing reputation is something that companies always want to do and always have to do. And you can use this reporting tool for that, obviously, as well. Increasing trust, I've been speaking about that. It's not just internal stakeholders, your employees. It is also stakeholders, society at large, people out there that you're in business with, your business partners and others. So increasing trust is extremely important, obviously, in business. And that is very much true, obviously, for investors. Whether it's a private equity investor that has an investment in your company, whether it's shareholders that are buying your shares, whether it's institutional investors that are trading with your shares. So it is very important to create this trust, and being transparent about what you're doing in your human rights due diligence is a very good tool for that. And the last point I would like to briefly mention is attracting new talent. If you look at the values the Generation Z has and the way they perceive companies, it is highly important that you create trust with them and that you show and demonstrate to them that you're a company that really takes care beyond just the bottom line, that you're a company that takes care of wider societal issues, and that it specifically takes care that it is respecting human rights and social rights. So employer branding is something where this reporting and the content of the reporting can be used in a very wise way. This was just 30 minutes of brief input by us. So as I was saying before, feel free to get back to us. And we'll now go into the question that we see in the chat, in the Q&A box, and try to answer some of them, all of them if possible. And if anything's left, we'll answer that obviously later. So the first question is, so the report will be generated. I guess this is the report on the LkSG, which is meant here is that. So the report will be generated when completing the questionnaire, or does it need to, or does a separate report need to be generated? Stephanie, do you have a good answer for that?
Yeah, sure. So as we understand it, is that it will be generated automatically out of the questions, and that the BAFA is working on a digital system, let's say, or on the IT behind it. So yeah, that's how we understand it for now, and how what we can read out of the further information that the BAFA has published.
Okay, thanks. Then there's a question which is a bit related to that, so I'll jump to that. And the question is, do you have any idea on human rights related KPIs that would be beneficial to track and set targets against in relation to Lieferketten-Gesetz? So
should I maybe go for that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so this is also, of course, a very important topic, right? That now that we have the risk assessment, companies are already doing the risk assessments and implementing their measures. The big question is, okay, how can we measure? Which KPI should we use? If you think of human rights, of course, if you think of the state of the art, we definitely have a lot of KPIs in terms of processes that we can measure whether are we taking the process we should take to reduce the risk, right? And for that, you can have a lot of examples like the CHRB, the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, which you can use as a reference, for instance. But of course, the ultimate goal is to avoid impact on the ground, on people. And these are indicators still that we hope to develop further. Of course, the business and human rights community is continuously discussing it. But of course, as a company, you should try to already think of what kind of indicators I could use to really measure the impact on the ground. One example I could give is that you could use, for instance, information from tools for workers' voice on the ground, understanding the feedback from them. This would be one example of this could be kind of information you could use to set indicators to measure performance on the ground. But in summary, I would say there's no perfect answer now. I think it's really important to understand your risks, you understand your measures, define the KPIs you need to measure your processes, whether your processes are rightly in place. And of course, as a second step, try to understand which KPIs you should set so that you can really measure the impact on the ground. Hope it helps answering your question.
Right. Thanks a lot, Raquel. So there's another question which is more general, maybe both of you can give just an answer to that one. It says, are there any guidelines out there on how to conduct a comprehensive human rights risk assessment?
Yes, sure. I can maybe start, and Raquel, you can maybe complement if there's anything you would like to add. Well, it's not a practical guideline as such, but obviously the one that we are kind of the guiding star of it all are the UNGPs, right? To really understand what responsibilities companies have and what their due diligence processes should entail. That just to mention that. But then there is obviously a lot of different guidelines out there from different kind of institutions, also how to really conduct a human rights risk assessment. However, yeah, it's a little bit difficult to point to specific ones. It also depends, do you want to go beyond the LkSG to some extent, so to take a more holistic approach, or are you looking into actually purely comply with the LkSG as a first step? But there are well-used guidances of the Danish Institute for Human Rights. For example, also the UN Global Compact Network has some guidance out there. So I guess there is a variety, but yeah, it really needs to take a bit of time to read into it, especially when it comes really down to the methodology about how to assess the severity of human rights risks and how to assess your management capacity. That's, yeah, a field that needs to expertise to build up, and we see a lot of training is coming out in that space as well.
Yes.
You want to add, Raquel?
Yes. Yes. No, I'd like to add to that besides, of course, the guidelines that Stephanie mentioned, and of course we have the SHIFT project, we have a field out there. Also the BAFA released the guideline in terms of risk assessment, right? Which we definitely think it's quite useful, of course, and then it's coming from the BAFA is very important to take a look at. But I just wanted to complement, as Stephanie said, I think in terms of the core of how to conduct a risk assessment, the UN GPs, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are always the basis. They are the basis actually for all these other tools. Just wanted to highlight, because we're talking about reporting, that the CSRD, the review of the non-financial reporting directive, is engaging with several stakeholders, and they're definitely using the risk assessment approach of human rights to set their standards, looking to severity with scale, scope, remediability. What I would recommend anyone is really to rely on the expertise of those that have been implementing risk assessments, because even though there are guidelines out there, I think the challenge is always to make it to put it in practice, right? So you have the guidelines, but to really make it happen in practice, it demands certain expertise. And I think we nowadays, since we have the UNGPs for the last 10 years, I think we have people already with experience in putting it in place.
Thanks a lot. I think that's it's very important to say that. It's, of course, it's our business to do that, but it's also, it takes a special knowledge that most companies obviously do not have, because they're good at doing the things they're doing, creating the products and managing their supply chain. And this is usually, it's a topic where we find that companies simply need to start understanding what human rights are about, that they are specific and they need a specific understanding. That's why it is so important to also talk to people about that, outsiders that will help you understand it. Just a written guidance usually is not enough to really understand. You need to reflect and reflect with outsiders there. Okay, so there's another question which says, how does a company report due diligence requirement where the supply chain is located in different countries with weak law enforcement, and what is the responsibility of the company?
Should I maybe start, and maybe you guys can complement in terms of the responsibility, right? So I have to say that the responsibility of the company is to conduct the diligence. So the company has to really make sure it has all the processes that are possible to put in place, of course, giving it size, its leverage, to avoid that the risks turn into real impact, right? And meaning that in terms of your supply chain, you have to have a risk-based approach. You really need to make sure you have, that's why the risk assessment is so important, that you have a good risk assessment. You can really select very well suppliers with whom you're going to engage and understand their management capacity, maybe go to the ground, conduct audits, maybe conduct survey with workers, so that you really do things for the risk. So I would say that this is our responsibility, but I'm sure Markus and Stephanie, maybe you have something else to add to that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, just to complement is that, because it was specifically mentioned, like, for example, regarding the location of the different suppliers, maybe having suppliers in countries with weak law enforcement. So when we look at the supply chain and conduct risk assessment, there are always two factors, right? So how risky is the actual raw material, or also intermediary product, or also service that you're sourcing? What kind of risks lie inherently in this buying category, basically? And then also looking as a second factor coming into place, the country risks. So if you then, for example, have you source a raw material which is also sort of medium risk, and then source it from a country with very high human rights risk because of very weak law enforcement, and some reports have mentioned that there are cases of forced labor or child labor, etc. That then basically this becomes a very high risk. This pool of suppliers that then falls within this product category and country would become like a high risk and needs to be there need to be put other measures into place than maybe suppliers that are based in countries with very good human rights in protection, and maybe also sourcing products that are highly automized, for example, in production, and use less manual labor and no migrant labor, etc. So I guess that I wanted to mention. And regarding the responsibility, maybe important to point out as we talk about the LkSG is that regarding the deeper supply chain, as many of you know, the responsibility of the company in compliance matters seen is that you need to act if you have substantiated knowledge of an issue in your deeper supply chain. But as we know, in reality, that's sometimes really difficult to judge what is substantiated knowledge when, you know, a lot of reports are already out there from NGOs. So it is both from a risk perspective and also reputation perspective and compliance perspective safer to already include the deeper supply chain in your risk assessments and be more proactive about it. And actually also the BAFA Handreichung that is now out there on risk assessment also mentions that as a recommendation to companies to be proactive regarding the deeper supply chain.
Yeah, to maybe also make sure that, let's say, don't be misled by things like, well, European countries are always safe. We have carried out projects inside Europe, and weak law enforcement was a problem and is a problem. And it's not even just countries in Southern Europe. It's we had cases in Germany where law enforcement simply did not act. And so I think that is what the UN guiding principles are actually about. They clearly say you are responsible whether law enforcement works or not. Where you have influence, you need to make sure your human rights are being respected. So I think it's important to be aware that law enforcement is weak or has gaps, maybe let me put it that way, nearly everywhere. There are different, let's say the scope, the severity certainly is different, but it's all shades of gray at the end of the day. That's something that you should always have in mind when you look at these kind of risk assessments. So as time is up, I would say let's answer one more question. So there's one question which is actually fairly easy to answer, which says, are suppliers of subsidiaries abroad also to be considered in the risk analysis? And the answer is very easy, because it's simply yes. If you're taking a risk-based approach, always look at where potential risks are lying. And that's obviously suppliers to subsidiaries also in other countries that you should be looking at. So we have a few more questions, but no more time. Sorry to all of you that have asked questions. We will answer them. We will send you an email with the answers to these questions, and we will let you know. So thank you very much for the answers, and sorry for that we could not answer all of them. Let me just say at the end of this, first of all, there's a short survey. Once we're closing the webinar, we'd ask you to please just answer the questions, just 6 questions. Secondly, we of course can in 45 minutes not share all of the knowledge that we have. You know, don't hesitate to get in touch if there's more you would like to know or expertise you would need. Let me know, send us an email to either Steffi, Raquel, or myself, or just give us a call. And thirdly, I would like to thank, of course, obviously, Steffi and Raquel for their input, for preparing this, and for sharing their knowledge, part of their knowledge with us. and also to Sarah and Maxine, who are managing all of this in the background. Thanks a lot to all of you, and have a nice lunchtime and a nice afternoon. Thanks a lot for attending.